Be easier if this had arrived as something obvious, a feeling, a confession, a moment dramatic enough to point at and say, there, that's where everything changed. But nothing about this happened that way. There was no single moment, no beginning I can isolate, no precise second where you became different from everyone else. That's what makes this difficult to explain, because most connections announce themselves. They arrive with intensity, with excitement, with enough emotional noise that people immediately recognize something unusual is happening. This didn't. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. At first, you were simply there, part of the background, part of the flow of ordinary interactions that come and go without leaving any permanent mark. Nothing stood out. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing suggested that months later I would still be tracing the shape of your presence through thoughts I never intended to share with anyone. And yet, here I am, trying to understand how someone can become significant without ever asking to be trying to understand how a person can occupy space in your mind without force, without effort, without even seeming aware that they're doing it. Most people create impact through action. You never did. Your impact came through consistency, and consistency is dangerous, not because it overwhelms you, because it bypasses your defenses entirely. You expect intensity. You prepare for people who arrive loudly. You know how to protect yourself from obvious attachment. You know how to recognize influence when it's trying to shape you. But consistency? Consistency works differently. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It simply appears every day until one morning you realize its absence would change the shape of your world. And that realization is never comfortable because once you notice it, you can't pretend it isn't there. That's what happened with you. Not suddenly, gradually, almost invisibly. Like water reshaping stone, not through force, through presence. The strange thing is that I spent a long time convincing myself it meant nothing. Not because I believed that, because believing otherwise felt irresponsible. I've always trusted structure more than feeling. Structure can be measured. It can be tested. It can be understood. Feelings are unreliable. They change. They fluctuate. They convince people that temporary things are permanent. I've seen it happen too many times. That's why I never allow myself to make decisions based solely on emotion. I observe, I evaluate, I wait. If something is real, time will reveal it. That has always been my philosophy, and time revealed something I wasn't expecting. You remained, not physically, not constantly, but psychologically, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much attention shifted elsewhere, no matter how many other conversations happened. Something about you remained present, not demanding attention, not asking to be remembered, simply existing, and that persistence started to raise questions I couldn't answer. Why you? Why not someone else? Why did your words seem to carry weight long after they were spoken? Why did your perspective linger after conversations ended? Why did my mind continue returning to things that should have faded naturally? For a long time, I thought I was searching for an explanation. Now, I think I was avoiding one, because explanations create responsibility. The moment you understand something clearly, you can no longer claim confusion. And confusion is comfortable. Confusion allows delay. It allows distance. It allows you to postpone decisions. Clarity doesn't. Clarity demands response. That's why people spend so much energy avoiding it. Not because they can't see the truth, because they know what happens once they do. I knew what would happen too. That's why I resisted naming this for so long, because names create reality. The moment you define something, it stops existing as a possibility and starts existing as a fact. And facts change things, even when nothing external changes at all. The first real shift happened when I noticed how often I referenced you internally, not your words, not specific memories. You, your perspective, your way of seeing things. It started appearing inside my thought process, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. I would encounter an idea and immediately wonder how you would interpret it. I would notice something meaningful and instinctively imagine the way you might see it. Not because I needed validation, not because I needed agreement, because your perspective had become relevant. And relevance is significant, much more significant than people realize, because relevance determines what occupies mental space, what receives energy, what receives attention, what receives consideration. And once something becomes relevant enough, it starts influencing the architecture of your internal world. That's where I became uneasy, not because influence itself is frightening, because I never granted permission for it. It happened naturally, without negotiation, without conscious choice, like a door slowly opening because it was never actually locked. That possibility bothered me, because I've always believed I understood myself completely. I believed I knew my boundaries. I believed I knew exactly how close people could get. I believed I knew what mattered and what didn't. Then you appeared. And suddenly those assumptions didn't seem as certain. Not wrong. Incomplete. There's a difference. Wrong can be corrected. Incomplete requires reconstruction. And reconstruction is far more complicated, because it means accepting that something fundamental was missing from your understanding all along. That's what this feels like. Not the discovery of you, the discovery of a blind spot within myself, a space I didn't realize existed until something fit inside it perfectly. That's the part I keep struggling with, not your presence, the fact that there was room for it. Because if there was room for you, then perhaps I never understood myself as completely as I thought I did. Perhaps the boundaries I trusted weren't as absolute as I believed. Perhaps there are parts of me that still remain unexplored. And if that's true, then this connection isn't just changing how I see you, it's changing how I see myself. That realization carries consequences, because self-understanding has always been my foundation. The one thing I trusted above everything else, the one thing I believed couldn't surprise me, and yet, here I am, surprised. Not by who you are, by who I become in relation to you. Because there's a version of myself that only seems to exist when this connection is present, a version that questions less, a version that hides less, a version that feels less interested in maintaining perfect control, and I don't know what to do with that version yet. Part of me wants to dismiss it, to explain it away, to reduce it to coincidence or circumstance. That would be easier, simpler, safer, but simplicity has never interested me. Truth has, and the truth is becoming harder to ignore. Something changed, something meaningful. Something permanent enough that returning to who I was before no longer feels possible. Not because I've lost anything, because I've gained awareness. And awareness doesn't disappear once it arrives. You can ignore it. You can avoid it. You can pretend it doesn't matter. But you can't unknow it. Once you see something clearly, it remains visible forever. That's where I find myself now, standing between what I understood before and what I understand now. Trying to determine whether this is a beginning or simply a recognition of something that was already waiting to be seen. Either way, the outcome is the same. I'm no longer standing outside it. I'm inside it, and that changes everything. There's something strange about reaching a truth you never intended to find. Not because the truth itself is difficult, because once it exists, it quietly reorganizes everything around it. I think that's what has been happening to me. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly enough that I didn't notice the extent of it until the change was already complete. The world still looks the same. The routines remain intact. The responsibilities haven't disappeared. Nothing external would suggest that anything significant has happened. And yet, internally, nothing sits where it used to. The shift is subtle, almost invisible. But I feel it every day. I feel it in the pauses between thoughts, in the moments where my attention drifts without permission, in the way certain ideas immediately lead back to you without any obvious reason. Not because I'm searching for you, because some part of my mind now assumes your presence. That assumption is what unsettles me, because assumptions only form after repetition, after consistency, after enough evidence accumulates that the brain stops treating something as temporary. And apparently, somewhere along the way, my mind stopped treating you as temporary. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it happened gradually, maybe it happened all at once, and I simply noticed too late. Either way, the result is the same. You became part of the landscape, not the center of it, not the entirety of it, but part of it, a permanent feature, something that exists whether I focus on it or not. That realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I've always believed attachment announces itself. I thought it arrived loudly. I thought it came with emotional urgency, with obvious longing, with unmistakable need. But what if real significance doesn't arrive that way? What if the things that matter most enter your life quietly? What if they become essential before you even realize they're being woven into the structure of your thinking? That possibility changes everything. Because if significance can arrive silently, then protection becomes nearly impossible. You can defend yourself from what you see coming. You can prepare for obvious risks. You can establish boundaries around things that declare their intentions. But how do you protect yourself from something that never demanded entry? Something that simply became familiar? Familiarity is deceptive. People talk about it as though it's ordinary, comfortable, predictable, safe. But I think familiarity might be one of the most powerful forces that exists between two people, because familiarity doesn't require effort anymore. It becomes instinct, and instinct reaches places logic never can. That's what happened with you. You stopped feeling external, not because I invited you inward, because the distinction gradually disappeared. I stopped seeing you as something separate from my experience. You became part of the experience itself, part of how I process things, part of how I interpret them, part of how I understand certain truths. And once that happened, distance became complicated. Not impossible, just ineffective. Distance works when separation exists. Distance works when someone remains outside of your internal world. But what happens when they don't? What happens when they already exist inside the framework you're trying to create distance from? That's the contradiction I've been living with. Every instinct I developed over the years tells me to maintain clarity, to remain objective, to keep perspective. And yet, every attempt to apply those principles here leads me back to the same conclusion. This isn't confusion. This isn't projection. This isn't imagination filling empty space. It's recognition, pure recognition, the recognition of someone whose presence aligns with something deeper than preference, deeper than attraction, deeper than simple compatibility. There's a difference between liking someone and recognizing them. People confuse those things all the time. Liking is emotional, recognition is structural. Liking changes. Recognition remains. You can stop liking someone. You can grow apart. Circumstances can alter feelings, but recognition? Recognition survives even when everything else changes, because recognition isn't based on conditions, it's based on understanding. And understanding leaves marks, permanent ones. That's why this feels different from anything I've experienced before, because it doesn't depend on constant interaction. It doesn't require reassurance. It doesn't need proof every day. Its existence isn't measured by frequency. Its existence is measured by accuracy. And accuracy is difficult to argue with, especially when it continues revealing itself over time. There are moments now when I catch myself smiling at thoughts I haven't shared. Moments where I notice something meaningful and immediately understand how you would perceive it. Moments where an observation forms in my mind and somehow feels incomplete until I consider it from your perspective too. Those moments used to surprise me. Now they don't. Now they simply feel natural. And perhaps that's what frightens me most. Not the depth, the normality, because extraordinary things are easy to identify. They stand out. They demand attention. They remind you constantly that they're unusual. This doesn't. This feels ordinary, effortless, as though it belongs, as though it was always supposed to exist exactly where it does. And anything that feels that natural becomes difficult to question. You stop examining it. You stop analyzing it. You stop treating it as something temporary. You accept it, not consciously, automatically, the same way you accept gravity, the same way you accept breathing, the same way you accept the existence of things that no longer require verification. I think that's where I am now, past questioning, past denial, past the need to constantly evaluate whether this is real. The question isn't whether it's real, the evidence for that has accumulated beyond dispute. The real question is what reality requires from me now, because awareness creates responsibility. The more clearly you see something, the less acceptable avoidance becomes. And I see this clearly, painfully clearly, not because I understand every detail, not because I know exactly where this leads, but because I know what it has already become. Something significant, something integrated, something that no longer exists at the edge of my awareness, and significance demands honesty, at least from yourself. Perhaps that's why I've been circling the same thoughts repeatedly. Not because I'm confused, because I'm preparing to admit something I've known for longer than I've been willing to acknowledge, that your presence isn't temporary, not in the way most people are. Most people pass through your life. Some stay longer than others. Some leave stronger impressions. Some remain as memories. But very few alter the framework itself. Very few change the lens through which you view reality. Very few become reference points. You've become a reference point. And reference points are powerful. Every decision is measured against them. Every realization is compared to them. Every future experience is interpreted through them. That's why losing one changes everything. Not because the reference point disappears, because its absence becomes visible everywhere. And that thought has started occupying more space than I expected. Not fear, not anxiety. Awareness, the awareness that meaningful things carry weight, the awareness that value creates vulnerability. The awareness that allowing someone to matter means accepting the possibility that one day their absence could matter too. I used to believe vulnerability was emotional exposure. Now, I'm beginning to think it's something else entirely. Maybe vulnerability is simply acknowledging value. Maybe vulnerability begins the moment you admit that something improves your existence, because once you admit that, you also admit that losing it would affect you. And that requires courage, far more courage than most people realize. It's easy to claim independence when nothing meaningful is at stake. It's easy to appear unaffected when you haven't allowed anything close enough to matter. The real challenge begins when something does matter. When something reaches a level where pretending indifference becomes dishonest. That's where I find myself now. Standing at the edge of an honesty I've avoided for longer than I care to admit, not because I feared the truth, because I understood the consequences of accepting it. The moment I fully acknowledge what this has become, I can no longer treat it as a possibility. I have to treat it as reality, and reality changes the rules. Reality asks questions that possibilities never have to answer. Reality demands choices, movement doctrine, and I can feel those questions approaching, not aggressively, not urgently, just inevitably, like footsteps getting closer in a quiet room. I know they're coming. I know eventually I will have to answer them. Not because someone else asks, because I will, because there comes a point where self-awareness refuses to tolerate avoidance any longer, a point where the truth becomes too obvious to keep framing as uncertainty. I think I'm approaching that point. Maybe I've already reached it. Maybe this entire reflection is evidence that I have. Because people don't spend this much time examining something meaningless. They don't revisit the same realization repeatedly unless it carries weight. And this carries weight. More than I intended, more than I expected, more than I was prepared for. But perhaps preparation was never the point. Perhaps some things arrive specifically to reveal the limits of preparation, to show you that no amount of control can account for every possibility, to remind you that life still contains experiences capable of surprising even the most careful minds. If that's true, then maybe you were never meant to fit into the systems I built. Maybe you were meant to reveal where those systems ended. And if that's the case, then perhaps the real question isn't whether this belongs in my life. Perhaps the real question is whether I'm finally ready to stop treating it like an exception and start accepting it as part of who I've become.